Welcome back, Season 1, Episode 2, Are They Real? I'm your host, Joe Baker, and coming up on today's show, we've got the second half of The Incident at Devil's Den by Terry Lovelace, where we're going to be discussing how the actual abduction went back in 1977, and also the government's involvement after it. And I have to say, this story blew my mind, so stay tuned for a bit more, and let's get stuck in. So if you missed last week's podcast, it's worth going back and checking that out just so this one makes a little bit more sense. But we're going to be continuing on from where we left off with Terry. After a few weeks after he left high school, in 1973, he decided to enlist in the Air Force. Not that he particularly wanted to be a pilot or fly. It was just the fact that his parents couldn't really afford an education for him, so he decided to take advantage of getting an education in the Air Force. Terry really wanted to go to college, but it just wasn't on the cards, unfortunately, for him, so that's why he decided to enlist, and he enlisted for 6 years, and decided to train to become an EMT, and also a medic. So after he completed his training, he was assigned to Whiteman Air Force Base, which is by Kansas City. Terry's main role was driving the ambulance and assisting with accidents, basically paramedic sort of thing. So it was during his role here that he met a chap called Toby, who he worked alongside with, who rapidly became his best friend. Now, Toby and Terry were quite happy to work the night shift together, and they were pretty much the only ones because it allowed them to both study. Now, they both wanted to study different things. Terry was studying law because he wanted to become a solicitor, and Toby was into astronomy and the stars and all that sort of thing. So, skipping forward 2 years down the line to 1975, Toby and Terry are very good at what they do. They work together. They're a fantastic team. They can rely on each other, and their friendship has gone beyond, colleagues. They're now pretty much best mates. So one night they're playing a game of cards, and all of a sudden the crash phone goes, which means there's been an accident. So Terry rushes out to the ambulance to get it started, while Toby takes the phone call and then rushes out to meet him in the ambulance, and off they go. So with blue lights flashing but no sirens because it's 2 o'clock in the morning and the roads are pretty much empty and those things give you a really bad headache, Toby filled Terry in on what was going on. So all the information that they had was that a missile technician had fallen whilst he was carrying out routine maintenance on a missile, and that he was conscious and awake, but that was pretty much all the information that they had. So when they were around 5 minutes out, Terry radioed through to give the people an update of how far away they were, when he noticed that there was like an orange cloud up ahead in front. What they realised it actually was a mixture of exhaust fumes from a bunch of emergency vehicles that had been left running, and all the lights flashing away, which was given a really eerie sort of glow. By the time they got a few miles away, there was a roadblock with 2 police officers stopping the traffic. So they announced themselves and they got waved through, and they asked the policeman, "Any idea what's going on down there?" And the police said, "No, we haven't been told anything. We're too far away to see. We haven't got a clue." So fair enough, off they went to get in a bit closer to see what was going on. When they arrived, they were greeted by pretty much chaos. There was a bunch of emergency vehicles all parked up, flashing lights, lots of engines running. There were a full team of over 30 people with M16 rifles just sort of all there in position. There were people ducked down. There were people staring up at something. And it was just complete chaos. So that pretty much ruled out the training exercise, which is what Toby initially thought it was. So they drove in a bit further and they encountered the captain there who was on base in his parka outside, freezing cold, basically waving them with one hand and talking on a walkie-talkie with the other. So as they got up a bit closer, the captain said to them, "Look, your patient is walking and talking, but we've got something going on at the moment. You're going to need to stay in the ambulance and not come out until you're called." "Yes, Captain," Terry said. Then after the captain walked off, he said to Toby, "So what do you think's going on here then?" And Toby says, "I have got no idea, but I'm going to go have a look-see and find out." So he stuck his parka on, jumped out of the ambulance, and off he went. And Terry was just stunned that obviously Toby's just total disregard for the orders, but off he went. 10 minutes later, Toby comes back and he's like, Terry, get out, you've got to come and see this. You're never going to believe it. Come quick, come with me, come and see this. So Terry got on his parka and jumped out the ambulance and went with Toby. And the sight that greeted him was a lot of soldiers, all with their rifles pointing up in the air. He saw the captain stood in the middle of the road where he had been previously, only now he was holding a pistol, and he was gaping up in the air with his mouth open, just cold steam billowing out, just gobsmacked. So then Terry looked up to see what everyone was looking at, and that's when he saw it. There was a large black diamond-shaped object just floating, hovering there above one of the silos. Toby was laughing, going, can you believe it? Look at that. And Terry, the only thing he could think of to say was, Toby, ain't that some really freaky shit? Toby just laughed, and they both stood there, mesmerised, just staring at this thing. So, as I mentioned, it was a black diamond. It was around the size of a minivan, and a lot of the emergency vehicles had their lights pointed up to it, and they could see it clear as day. It was just there, hovering about 50 foot above one of the missile silos. It had a non-reflective, matte black surface. They couldn't see any visible engines or propellers or exhaust fumes or anything. It was just sat there. They watched it for what seemed like around 10 minutes or so, and everyone just didn't want to look away in case they missed something. Then all of a sudden, it happened. It just shot off, and within a second, it was gone out of sight. It had gone that fast. Everyone just stood around staring, just watching over to the eastern sky where this thing had just vanished off. Then Terry looked around and he could see the captain who told him to stay in the van, but he wasn't upset with him. He was just looking like, did you see that as well? He just had this look on his face, and everyone was just in shock and just like, wow. Then once everything had sort of died down a bit, the captain came over to them and said, look, you guys need to go and get your man. I'll get the gate open for you, and off you go. So Terry and Toby went to find their patient who'd been brought up from the bottom of the missile silo. So the missile silos are actually 75 feet deep, so that they can house a 60-foot intercontinental ballistic missile. They weren't aware of how far the chap had fallen, but his friends had brought him up to the top and they went to see him. The poor guy was sat with his foot up on a trash can and had been told by the captain, you've got to stay in there until the ambulance people come and arrive, the paramedics come and see you. And he'd missed everything. He wasn't allowed to go outside, so he hadn't seen the diamond in the sky. He hadn't seen anything. All he knew was something crazy was going on, and he missed out. And all he could think to talk about to Terry and Toby, he was just like, please tell me what's going on. I really need to know. He didn't care about his foot. He was just really wanted to know what he'd missed out on. So Toby just jumped right in and told him. He was just like, wow, you should have seen this thing. It was unbelievable. And Terry also decided to join in, and he carried on telling this guy, the poor bugger, he must have been devastated missing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity like that just because he wasn't allowed to leave because he'd just fallen and broken his foot. So they loaded their patient up into the ambulance and got everything sorted and set off back towards the base. And on the way, they saw a bunch of military helicopters flying back over them towards where they'd just come from. Now, the puzzling thing was, three of them looked at each other and they were like, well, they could have got there a lot faster than the military police could have, so why weren't they there? Which is a bit of a puzzle. Obviously, that was above their pay grade, so not to ask that sort of question, so they just carried on their way. When they got back, they dropped off their patient, and their commanding officer called them into the office for a debrief. And Terry says that his commanding officer was a really nice guy. He was very, very good to them. Didn't treat them like shit like a lot of the other guys did. So he debriefed them. He asked, "Did you fill anything in about the craft in your report?" And they both said no, of course not. So the commanding officer took the reports off them. He obliterated the dates off them, and he filed the reports in his desk. Then he said to them, "Well, what happened? Tell me all about it." So they both told him for over 10 minutes. The commander couldn't get enough detail out of them. He just wanted to know everything. Once they'd finished telling him, he asked them if they could draw it. So they both got out the black felt tips, and they sketched out the diamond craft that they'd seen. Now Toby had obviously had a bit of a better look at it than Terry, because he'd counted all the panels on the side, which he'd drawn very accurately. Both pictures were very, very similar, and the commanding officer looked at them. Then he filed them in the drawer with both the reports. And Toby said to him, he said, "What do you think it was then, Commander?" And the CO said, "Well, guys, that's a prototype helicopter. It's top secret, so you're not allowed to tell anyone about this. Do you understand?" And in unison, they both said, "Yes, sir." Clearly, the guy was lying. He didn't have a clue what it was, but obviously he understands secrecy. They understand secrecy, so they all have to roll with, it's a prototype helicopter, which clearly it wasn't. The CO said to them, "Look, you make sure you don't run your mouths about this. You've seen something now. You need to keep quiet about it, so don't do anything stupid and like talking to people about it." So once again, in unison, they both said, "Yes, sir," and off they went. So the first thing that they did was obviously tell all their friends about it. They didn't call any newspapers or report it to anything like that, but in their close circle of friends, they run their mouths. They said everything they could about it, because it was just such an amazing experience. Thankfully, this had no further repercussions for them, which was a good thing. When they got home from their shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, they cracked open a beer and they spoke with Toby's wife, who obviously she wanted to know everything. So they drew pictures, they told her. Terry went home and told his wife. She wanted to know everything about it. And thankfully, that was pretty much the end of that at that point. So several months passed uneventfully. And then after they'd finished their morning shift, Toby said to Terry, I got a bit of an idea. I think it would be really good to go camping. And Terry was like, "What?" He said, we don't do camping. We're city folks. We don't know anything about camping." And Toby said, "Oh, just think how nice it would be. You know, we can go, you can take your camera, you can get some nature shots. He said, I can look up at the stars, you know, I can take the binoculars and everything. It'll be a really good trip." So Terry had a bit of a think about it, and he wasn't really sold on the idea, and he just tried to veto it and wasn't very interested. But Toby somehow managed to persuade him into it. Now Terry thought that Toby meant, you know, take the wives with them, take the kids, and he just didn't think that they'd be up for that. But as it turned out, Toby actually just meant for the two of them to go. And when he explained this and said, you know, how often are you going to be able to get a chance to be so close to a nature reserve to get these fantastic pictures? Terry had just bought himself a new camera and he was itching to give it a go, but because they lived on a military base next to intercontinental ballistic missiles, going around taking pictures was sort of frowned upon. So he really wanted to be able to get out and actually have a go of taking some of these pictures, and the idea of going out and getting some fantastic nature snaps really sold the idea to him. So Terry agreed. He said, obviously, I'll speak to the wife first. So he went home and spoke to the wife, and the wife said, yeah, I think it's a good idea, although we should check with Tammy first, which is Toby's wife, to see what she says. And both the wives had agreed to it, so they were both really chuffed and decided to start planning this camping trip. Now, it soon rapidly became all-consuming. It was all they could think about. They couldn't really finish their work properly because all they were thinking about was this camping trip. Now, Terry and Toby were very intellectual and known on the Air Force Base as a pair of nerds because they were both studying for their college course, one to be a solicitor, the other pretty much physics, astrophysics and astronomy. So they decided to tackle the problem of the camping trip like they would any other problem. They bust out the paper and pens and started to plot everything out on paper. Now, they created inventories of things they'd need to take with them, and they pretty much accounted for everything on there. They'd been making this list for weeks, and it was very, very thorough. As the time came closer to actually go, the excitement was pretty much overwhelming for the pair of them. So when the fateful day actually came, they packed everything up, or so they thought, and they were out on the road, and they were going. They had music on. It was the typical sort of that scene you see in films where they drive in with the windows down and the music playing, and they are loving life, just excited to be going on the open road. Terry was driving, he had his foot down, not so much to get pulled over for speeding, but they were on their way. Now the park was miles and miles away. You're talking, I think they mentioned in the book it was at least a 6-hour drive from where they were. And although there were a lot of other national parks much closer to them, Toby had specifically wanted to go to Devil's Den. Now, he sold the idea to Terry as it being part of the adventure, the long drive to get there, that they were really going out, and he was explaining how good the bluff would be up there for him to look at the stars, and how good the photography would be there so that he could capture his Ansel Adams styled black and white pictures. So Terry was all on board for going there. Now, they'd been driving, and they pulled over in a gas station to fuel up and grab a few extra beers and that sort of thing. So they did that, and they were back on the road, and they were about 3 hours into their trip when Terry realised he'd forgotten his camera. And he was like, "Shit, Toby, pull over, we need to check." So they went into the back into his Chevy to look, and sure enough, he'd full on forgotten his camera. He was tamping, and he was like, if we go back for this now, that's 6 hours. It's 3 hours back home, 3 hours back to where they were, and it would be 6 hours, and they'd be no further than they were right now. So Terry decided just to take it on the chin, act like a grown-up, and just say, "Look, let's just go anyway," because they can get there. And Toby said the Eagles aren't going anywhere. They're still going to be there next time we go. We'll go this time. We can work out all the bugs from the camping trip, and then maybe next time we can take the girls with us and the kids, and we'll have a really good time. So Terry agreed, and off they went. He was gutted, though. He was really gutted, but they drove all the way there. Now, when they got to the park, they'd already decided that they weren't going to stay in the main area. Now, the main area, obviously, where you're supposed to go camping, had things like toilets and obviously all the other families, and they didn't want the distraction of having kids run around and all this sort of thing. So even though they'd never been camping and didn't have a clue what they were doing, they decided that they were going to go to a more secluded area of the park, which they weren't supposed to go to. So they followed a trail up a little bit further and found a gated fence sort of thing that was chained up. And they jumped out and lifted the chain off, went through the gate, and off they went. So they were driving through a trail. They were driving over some small streams, and really they needed a Jeep or a Land Rover to go through this. But they managed to get through, and they were driving underneath a big canopy of trees, and it was really beautiful. And it was breathtaking, Terry said. It was absolutely stunning. And then they came across where they decided to stop, and it was just like this open expanse of meadow on a bluff, and it was just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So they parked up the car, and they got out and had a stretch, and Toby said, let's get everything set up, let's get the camp set up, which is the sensible thing to do. But for some reason, Terry was adamant that he wanted to go hiking first to go and make the most of the sunlight while they still had it. Toby argued that, it's obviously best to get everything set up first, but for some reason, Terry just really wanted to get going. So they decided to go hiking first, then they were going to come back and set the camp up. So off they went, and they walked and walked and walked, and they covered around 3 miles straight as the crow flies. Terry said he thought it was closer to around 5 miles. Now, on their way there, I forgot to mention earlier, but Toby was drawing a little map from every little turn that they made, even in the car. So they'd made a map, which they then put into the glove box of the way they'd come through all the trails. And now they were out and about walking, but they didn't have a map with them for this part now. So eventually they come to a point which has got a stunning view, and they sit down and they have a breather, and Terry just looked around and said, this is it. This is why we came here. This is absolutely beautiful. And Toby agrees, and they both just lay down for a minute, and all of a sudden Terry starts to feel really sleepy, which he's kind of confused about, because there's a difference between being tired and being sleepy. Now, he shouldn't really be feeling sleepy. Tired, yes, from the drive, but not sleepy. So he has a bit of a yawn, and, the sun's beating down. He closes his eyes for a second, and then the next thing he knows, Toby's kicking him to wake him up, shouting, "Terry, come on, wake up, quick, we gotta go. So Terry startles awake, and he realises that it's starting to get dark, and they haven't set the camp up, and they're about 5 miles trek to try and get back. So they break into a run, and they sprint in to try and get through the forest to get themselves back, and they're panicking, but Terry says to Toby, "Look, we need to stop running for a second and just gather our thoughts." So they stop and they look around, and Toby just says, "Hang on, we're going the wrong way. It's over this way." So Terry says, "Right, okay, let's go that way then." So off they go, and they follow the trail back. Thank God for Toby, because Terry said he didn't have a clue where they were. If it wasn't for Toby, he'd never have made it back. So Toby actually managed to get them all the way back home at a bit of a jog and a bit of a run. So when they finally saw the car, Terry was just in relief, because he thought, there was a good chance if Toby hadn't been there that they could have just died out there. They would have been stuck out in the wilderness, no way of actually knowing how to take care of themselves in the woods, and anything could have happened to them, really. So they got back to the car, and they decided to get everything set up. Once they'd had a little breather, they were going to get the tent set up and go out and get firewood. Now, because Toby was a dad and had kids, he was used to putting toys together. It suddenly became his job then that he had to put the tent together, which makes sense. So Terry decided to go out and gather firewood. Now, he went to check the car and realised he'd forgotten the hatchet that they were going to use. So he ended up picking up like a rusty knife, which he couldn't really cut through anything with. So he just gathered up the bulk of wood that he could find, just bits here. So what he was missing in quality wood, he made up in quantity. He came back with armfuls of bits of sticks and everything, and Toby managed to set the tent up. And when they went back to the car to sort of take stock of everything, they realised that they were missing loads of stuff. It wasn't just his camera. There was loads of things missing. Terry points out at this point that they're not this inept. They're not this dull. Every day when they're in work, they do an inventory for the ambulance. They make sure everything's stocked. They work off lists, and they're very thorough. Now, they'd done the same for this trip. They'd made the list. They'd prepped everything. But for some reason, they just left it all behind, and this was not like them. This isn't their first rodeo, They had forgotten all sorts of things, including their food, their water, just pretty much everything. Thankfully, they had a couple of cans of beers and some sausages that they'd bought from the petrol station on the way, the fuel station, and they decided to cook them over the fire. Now, they got everything set up, they'd made the fire, and they were deciding, should we just go back home, because they were just missing so much stuff. But Toby said, look, it's getting dark, it's going to be dangerous to take this drive back home, because we just don't know where we are. Whilst I've got my little map, it's going to be very difficult to follow that back through the woods at night time. There's a very good chance we could get lost and make our situation worse. We just need to suck it up and make the most of the night. So that's what they did. As I said, they bust out the sausages, they bust out a couple of cans of beer, and they settled in for the night around the fire. And as it turns out, it was lovely. They started to really enjoy just, being chilled out in the woods, listening to all the crickets and the birds and everything chirping away. And, they were chatting and looking at the sky. And as it got darker, they were settled in. Toby started pointing out constellations to Terry and talking to him about how the stars were time machines, the light that's leaving the stars we are seeing from millions of years ago, if sometimes even longer. And Terry was really chilled out and he was enjoying everything, and he said, this is pretty amazing. This must be how our ancestors used to live, before they had any other form of entertainment, just sitting around the fires, looking up at the stars. And he'd never seen the sky look like this before, because out in the national park there's no light pollution whatsoever. It was absolutely stunning. Now, as the fire burnt itself out, Terry noticed that all the sounds had gone. There was no sound to be heard. There was no crickets chirping. There was no frogs, no birds, nothing. It was dead quiet. So he turned to Toby and said, "Toby," "did you hear that?" And Toby said, "I don't hear anything." And Terry said exactly. He said, "An hour ago, the forest was alive with sounds, and now it's completely dead." And Toby just said to him, well, maybe it's a case of us or the fire scared them off, and, they'll probably be back in an hour. And Terry reluctantly sort of agreed with that statement, because, there was nothing else you could really say about it. And then Toby said, "Hey, Terry, look, check that out, man." So he looks up, and Toby's pointing. "Were they there before?" he says. And he said, "I don't think they were." And he's pointing at what looked like 3 stars that were slowly moving towards them. Now, they were pretty far away, and Toby knew pretty much what all the stars in the sky were, and, other astrological anomalies, and this was baffling him. So they sat in silence for the best part of 20 minutes, watching this thing very slowly moving across the sky towards them. And Toby said to Terry, is there an airport near here? I mean, those lights too bright for it to be an aircraft, but I mean, maybe." And Terry said, "Well, no, I mean, there's nowhere for a plane to even land around here. I mean, well, maybe in this meadow is probably the only place big enough for a small aircraft to land, but who'd be wanting to land an aircraft around here? Maybe marijuana smugglers, perhaps, but which I hope not, because then we'd be in a lot of trouble if there are. But no, it can't be a plane. The lights are too bright." So they carry on just sitting there, watching this thing getting closer. And as it's going past, all you can see all the stars blinking out, and the sheer size of this thing starts to dawn on them. It's so big that it's actually blanketing out fields of stars. And they're stunned. It's an awesome spectacle to watch. And as they're watching, the stars are basically pivoting, like they're pivoting on an axis, like the whole thing's turning round. Now, they watch as it gains altitude and gets closer towards them. And then Toby says to Terry, are you starting to feel tired?" And Terry's like, "Yeah," he said, "I'm beat, man. Today's been a long day. I'm absolutely exhausted." And Toby agrees. They both start to feel really tired. And as this thing starts flying over ahead, they realise that it's pretty much right above them and slowly starting to come down towards them. They lay there staring up at this triangle of darkness expanding, with the 3 points of light slowly pivoting around. It was like someone had just cut a triangle of darkness right out of the middle of the sky, so there was just no stars in the middle of it. And it came down lower and lower, and they just didn't move. They didn't have anything to say. They were totally calm, like didn't have a care in the world, as they just lay there watching this thing getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it got closer and closer to them. Eventually it stopped right above them, and the 3 lights were now so bright that they were lighting up the whole meadow. It was so bright it was casting shadows. And Toby reached over and picked up the flashlight and said, "I'm going to try and signal them." So he started flashing the flashlight at them. Then all of a sudden, a bright white light about the size of a baseball suddenly shone down directly on top of the campfire. It was so powerful you could see the outline of the light, like where it was shining. So it was like a powerful searchlight. It stayed there for a minute, and then it turned off. Next thing they know, it's replaced by this little pencil-thin blue light, which suddenly starts darting around all over the camp, just ping, 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 jumping from spot to spot to spot. It even lands on them. It doesn't hurt them, but it lands on them. It starts flittering all over the campsite, and then it stops. And Terry just says that they're completely overcome by apathy. They are exhausted, and they feel very, very strange. And Toby says to Terry, "Oh, well, the show's over. Let's go to bed." And in unison, they both get up, pick up their sleeping bags, and get into the tent, which is just so crazy. I mean, whatever these things are, they can clearly control emotions. They can control people's actions, and it reminded Terry of that incident when he was 11 years old. Just that crazy apathy that comes over, the total feeling of calmness and relaxation. He said as soon as they lay down and their heads hit the pillows, they were out cold, fast asleep. Getting abducted by aliens is a lot like getting your arm caught in some farm equipment. You might get loose, but you're going to lose something in the process. It was the spotlights from the craft that actually woke Terry up. They were shining through the flap, and he was like, "Oh my God, that hurts my eyes." His eyes were so light sensitive that they were stinging. He started to come around, but he didn't really know what was going on. He couldn't get his bearings. He couldn't figure out what had happened. His body felt like he'd been beaten up. He was hurting all over. He was sore. His eyes were swollen. And then he climbed up to get onto his hands and knees, and then he saw Toby. Toby was looking out through the tent flap, and he noticed that Toby was crying. Now, thinking about this, Toby and Terry are both paramedics. They've seen a lot of stuff, and Terry said he'd never seen Toby cry before, so obviously something bad had happened. They looked out, as he was looking out through the tent flap, Toby was just like, "Shh, they're still out there." And Terry was like, "Who? Who's still out there?" And he went to have a look, and he was trying to look out through the tent flap, but he had to slowly push Toby out the way, who was shaking. There were quick flashes of green and yellow, almost like strobe lights going on. Terry at first was thinking, is that like emergency services lights? But obviously that didn't fit because the colours were all wrong. Terry realised that Toby was panting like he was a dog. Terry said to him, "Toby, you need to get your breathing under control. You're gonna full on hyperventilate." So Toby was trying to calm himself down, but he just couldn't. And then Terry realised that there were people walking around outside the tent. He could see shadows moving through the flashing strobing lights. Once again, he said, "Toby, who's out there?" And Toby was just in silence. He just couldn't function at all. He was just in absolute shock. So Terry made his way to look out the tent flap, and as I said, he started to push Toby out of the way. He carefully moved the flap to one side with his left arm, and then he looked out and he saw it. And there it was. It wasn't the flying saucer, what he expected. It was the giant triangle thing from last night. It wasn't round, it was massive, it was so big, it was covering the whole of the meadow, and it was hovering about 30 feet off the floor. There was a white beam coming down from the very middle of it, and what looked like small children were wandering around the perimeter, just having a nose around, just not particularly looking like they were doing anything, like they were just checking the place out. Terry realised that the apathy that they'd both been feeling was completely gone. It had been replaced by abject terror, panic, and fear. They were in a hell of a state. Already knowing the answer to his question, Terry said to Toby, "Toby, why are the children walking around out there?" And Toby said, "They're not children, Terry. They're not even human." Terry already knew this, but, his brain was still just actively trying to deny what they were looking at. The craft that they were staring at, this big triangle, wasn't completely flat. This thing was around 5 blocks high, like it was like an apartment building, 5 stories high. Running down the 2 sides of it that they could actually see were just panels of light. Like if you were looking at a building and some of the lights were switched on, some of them weren't, and they could see that lighting up down both sides. And as they looked up the tower block of this huge triangle flying structure, they realised that the top sort of curved outwards slightly and had even bigger glass panels there, which they were trying to see up into, and they could see shadows moving around in there, but they couldn't clearly make anything out. Terry tried to take in as much of this as possible, because it's such an amazing sight. And although they were absolutely petrified and terrified, they were mesmerised by what they were looking at. This thing was just absolutely gigantic. So where this white beam of light, which was coming out of the middle of this giant flying triangle ship, it was about 30 foot across. That's how big this beam thing was, and the aliens who were milling around in groups of 2s and 3s were slowly making their way back over to it. And as they walked into it, they were being materialized straight up into it. And Toby and Terry were just astonished. And then Toby says to him, "They took us, Terry. They took me. They took you, and they hurt us." Terry started to have some memories flash back into his head. "Yeah, I know, Tobe." The memories that he had were of this blinding flash of white light, then being in the ship, and then he realised it was that beam in the middle that those aliens were dematerialising, go back onto the ship on. He remembered appearing in sort of like a hangar deck with them, and inside that hangar deck he saw like full-sized flying saucer craft parked there, like this was literally a mothership with smaller ships parked inside. And he was being led across, and obviously with the apathy still in place, they weren't really freaking out or anything like that. He remembers being completely awestruck looking around at the sheer size of the inside of the craft. He says everything was either a white or a metallic colour. He said there were walkways on different levels around the place. It was a full functioning ship. There were people going about their business, everything. He looked up on the walls and he recognised, or didn't recognise, but he could see symbols in the walls and on some of the monitors and units and things like that, which he just didn't recognise what they were. Obviously some sort of other language. Trying to take in as much detail as possible, he realised that they weren't alone on the ship, as in they weren't the only humans there. There was another 50 or 60 people, all in exactly the same state as they were. And Terry wonders, are they still there? Did the aliens bring them back? Are they gone? What happened to those other people? Terry and Toby were still sat looking out the tent, watching these little people slowly disappear into this white beam. Once the last one had gone, the beam shut off, and the low hum that was being produced from the craft shut off as well. And then they slowly watched it start to rise up in the air. It didn't shoot off like the other one. It just slowly rose, slowly turning up, up, up. It was exactly the opposite of what they'd watched the night before. And they watched slowly as it went up in the air, and then just very slowly out of sight, not a care in the world. It wasn't like they cared that they were being seen or anything. They just slowly up and off they went. Terry and Toby were sat in the tent, and they were just in bits after this experience. Both of them were in pain physically. They were both so thirsty that they'd never felt a burning thirst like this in their life, and they both agreed that they just needed to get out of there. So they decided that they were going to get back to the car, and they were going to head back, even though it was the middle of the night and it was going to be dangerous. But they were both petrified to leave the tent, because the tent was offering them some sort of cover. They were that scared, they didn't want to go outside. But they sucked it up and they ran to the car. They got into the car, and thankfully the little map that Toby had drawn was still in the glove box, and Terry jumped behind the wheel, and they set off back to try and get themselves back home again. Terry recalls that the pain they were in was severe. His eyes were nearly swollen shut, and he said he felt awful, like his skin was on fire, that it was itching all over. Toby was the same, only he, if anything, actually looked worse than Terry did. For a fleeting moment, it crossed Terry's mind how much of their stuff they'd actually left behind there. Their tent, their airbeds, just all this stuff. But, he couldn't care less. It was just a case of, yeah, that's got to stay, because we're out of here. The drive back was very, very difficult. They were trying to find their way back through these winding roads in the pitch black. The headlights were, because the road was so bumpy, the headlights were up and down. They couldn't really see what they were doing. Toby had to keep on putting the internal light on so he could read the map, but when he put the internal light on, it meant they couldn't see the path in front of them for the glare. So they were turning the lights on, turning the lights off, and they were both just in bits. The thirst was wrecking them. Their eyes were killing them. Their whole bodies were hurting. They felt like ants were underneath their skin. He describes that it was like having bugs just crawling underneath their skin. They were just desperate to get back. By the time Toby had managed to safely navigate them out of the trail and onto the main park area, Terry said, "Well done, Toby. I would never have done that without you." But at that point, literally, Toby was out cold already. He'd curled up into the fetal position, and he was snoring already. He was out cold. Terry continued driving through until the next day, just to get them back home as soon as they possibly could. And by about midday, Toby surfaced from his nap, and he said, "Oh, Terry, I'm so thirsty. Can we please stop to get a drink?" And Terry said, "Yeah, I'm just as thirsty as you are. As soon as we can find a service station, I'll pull over and we can get a drink." So they kept on going until they finally came across a service station, and the sun was wrecking his eyes now because the sun was up. Terry had been wearing sunglasses and they did absolutely nothing. He felt like he'd been staring directly at the sun for hours. The pain was almost unbearable in his eyes. When they pulled over to a gas station, he rushed out to get the key from the guy behind the counter who had it attached by a piece of 2x4. Then he ran to the toilet, and as soon as he got in there, he relieved himself and then looked in the mirror, and you could see how puffy his face was. He was bright red, like he'd been roasted in the sun all day. His eyes were swollen almost shut. He had red spots all over him. They covered him. He pulled down his pants to check. They were all over his legs. They were everywhere. His whole body looked like he'd been roasted and then bitten by like thousands and thousands and thousands of insects. He was covered in these tiny little red dots. Once he finished cooling his face down, he splashed some water and he started drinking from the tap, and he drank and drank and drank and drank and drank. And then as he opened the door to get out, Toby was stood there, and he came in straight away and obviously followed the exact same routine. Terry went into the service station and bought himself some cans of pop, and he recalls Toby buying himself some jugs of grape juice, and they jumped back in the Jeep for the journey home, and Terry polished all his off, and Toby drank about half of his and then had fallen asleep. And Terry had a fleeting thought about just taking Toby's drink and necking it. It was almost like he just didn't care. He notes at this point that something had changed between him and Toby, that they hadn't talked about it the whole journey. It was a non-starter subject about what had happened to them. He didn't even really want to see Toby or be with him. And these guys have been friends for years and years. They're best friends. They have barbecues every week. They regularly do stuff together. And for this to have all just suddenly changed instantly was very, very odd. But having reflected on this story, you'll come across this lots about people who've had these experiences. They don't discuss it. It just gets put to one side, and it breaks up families. It breaks up friends. It's part of the phenomenon. It's a very common thing. So Terry notes that for some reason this whole thing had changed his and Toby's relationship. Eventually, they got themselves back home, and Terry dropped Toby off at his house and then proceeded to his. When he got home, his wife was like, "Oh my God, look at the mess on you. What the hell happened? Why are you home so early?" Terry he needed just to have a cold bath and just to relax and unwind. So he went upstairs. He had a 30-minute bath in cool water. His wife had taken his temperature, and it was up at over 104. So she was obviously really worried about him. She kept topping him up on tumblers of ice-cold lemonade, which he just couldn't drink enough of. He was just guzzling it down. He was still in a lot of pain with his eyes. His wife put something like baking soda or something in the bath with him to try and ease some of the itching and the sunburn. Now, obviously, what was weird was that he was fully sunburned, every single part of his body. Now, when he'd fallen asleep outside, he was wearing sunblock. He was in the shade and he had clothes on. So how was he sunburnt from top to toe? So his wife said, "Come on, let's get you dressed. We're going to have to go to the clinic. You're not well." So off they went to the clinic, and the doctor did some tests and things, and he came in and sat down with Terry and said, "What happened to you and Toby?" He said, "You're really ill, like you're really, really ill." Your wife explains that you went camping together, and then you came home after one night. You'd cut the trip short because you woke up feeling really ill. Is that correct? "Yes, sir," Terry said. Terry filled him in on what had happened, well, most of what had happened. He filled him in on them arriving, them going for a walk, them, hiking, them falling asleep, them coming back, getting everything set up. He said that they felt fine, in the daytime. Obviously, he left on everything that happened from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning, just because otherwise he'd end up in a psych ward. But, he recalled what he could from the day, but he said it was also starting to become a bit of a blur, what had happened. But he told the doctor that's what had basically happened. The doctor put them in for one of the most thorough examinations that he's ever had. They took blood. They had him on a table. They were poking and prodding him. They had one of the residents come in with a camera and take pictures of every single inch of his body because he was covered in sunburn. He was covered in bites. And Harry also recalls that someone was in there with a Geiger counter checking over him, and you could hear the Geiger counter start to growl. Now, Terry's obviously very familiar with radiation sickness and poisoning because he works on a base with enough nuclear warheads to blow up all of Europe. So he's very familiar with what a Geiger counter sounds like. He's worried because he has had a small dose of radiation. The doctor says to his wife, you need to go home and bring everything that Terry's brought back with him. You need to put it in a bag, dirty clothes, souvenirs, rocks, anything like that. Anything he's brought home, you need to bring back. So the doctor gave her a special bag to put it all in, and off she went. Nurse Brenda said to Terry, "You were severely dehydrated," so she had him on an IV plugged into his arm, just constantly just dripping, trying to get him topped back up for his fluids. She was giving him water to drink as well, and just to try and get him back to normal. But he said the pain was bad. His eyes were stinging, they were swollen. He just couldn't get used to the lights in the room. He just felt absolutely terrible. His commanding officer came in to see him, to see what had happened, and so, Terry said exactly the same story to him as well. It was just crazy how they were covered from head to toe in sunburn, these little bites, and were now radioactive. And Terry thought to himself, it's bad enough going to a national park and coming back radioactive, but getting a dose of radiation on an alien spaceship just seems a bit too much to sort of bear. So, he obviously kept that to himself and just left the mystery for the doctors to try and sort of figure out. His commanding officer said, look, just take what time you need to get yourself better, which Terry was very grateful for. Once all the examinations had finished, Brenda put Terry into a wheelchair to wheel him back to a room so that he could basically sit in the dark because it was just so bright in there. And she said, when your wife gets back, we'll let you know where you are, which Terry was very grateful for. So we're going to leave that there for today now, and on next week's show we're going to be discussing how the government responds and reacts to this ordeal that Terry's been through, and I can tell you now, it's pretty shocking. So stay tuned for next week's episode and stay safe.